At the pleasure of the council, I might go through the questions I heard that staff, I believe, is in a position to answer for us. I heard Frank Giffey and others talk about how do we keep up with the infrastructure, traffic, what are our plans to handle that? Can we think about how we mitigate the effects of development as these projects come in, and how does, I mean, with respect to the question tonight, how does the process you're proposing help us or not in doing that? If I can add my own postscript on, since that's what we're trying to decide tonight.
Regardless of the process that's picked today, every project will have to go through its own environmental review, and part of that will be looking at all the impacts that the project creates and mitigations that the project has to provide. So that's irrespective of this process, whether the general plan amendment requests come in through this process or we don't change the process and they come in through the current process, which is the process as they come in, they will go through environmental analysis, and that's the time when you look at the impacts and mitigations. Okay.
The question about, let's see, what is the evaluation system? How is staff going to come and present these things for our consideration? What are the criteria? How does it work?
We are proposing the ones that you see on the screen. We're not going to grade the projects. It's mainly going to be information that says, here's the project, here are the drawings, here's a brief description of the impacts, whether they are or not providing affordable housing, here's how sustainable the project proposes to be, here are all the amendments that they request. And again, here are the amenities that they are choosing to provide, and here's the staff time and resources that are going to be required to process each project. So we're just going to provide the information, and the community gets to comment based on the information, and the council gets to make a decision based on the information, whether they want all the projects through the gate, whether they only want 2 for now and the rest have to wait to resubmit a year later. So these are the ones that we're recommending. I understand that we've had several comments on which ones not to include, but.
One question specifically while we have this chart up was, what does sustainability mean?
We should have been clearer. We meant environmental sustainability because projects come in proposing either the minimum amount required, some of them propose net zero. Both the council as well as the public tend to be interested in these features, and so we thought this would be a good point of information to provide everybody.
Okay. So the evaluation system is basically a write-up where you describe in a whole bunch of categories, and I'm assuming you would take council input in advance on categories that we'd like to hear about.
Right, they're here on this slide. If you want to revise them, we can revise them. But we don't plan to evaluate and grade 1, 2, 3. It's just information that's going to be provided. That's all. It helps make better decisions. So.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, are there other questions that, yeah, okay, so Jason Lundgaard asked, how would council members, when we have a slate of potential projects that we can look at, and a council member might be conflicted on one or the other, how would that process work? I mean, are we considering them in a bundled way, or would we be making decisions? Although they're coming at the same time, we'd be making individual decisions on each one, I guess, or what?
Yeah, the intent of the policy is not to bundle the project. It's to hear them all in the same day so that, you know, you can eventually evaluate them against each other. They would be up and down decisions on each one individually. So if a councilman had a conflict on one, they would just abstain from that decision.
And presumably the discussion that goes around that, right?
Yes.
And this is a statewide recognized process, and it's exactly what you do on the budget, for example.
Yeah.
You set aside the portion that has a conflict, you vote on it, and then you move on to the rest of the.
And we make
rest of
sure
the
that
budget.
it's segregated, although we're evaluating them in the same day, we carve
Yes,
out.
it's completely, so
Okay.
the question is, are you going to work out a process? Yes.
Right.
Can I follow up, please? So when I was mayor last year and when we did the general plan / housing element process, my family submitted an application about a little under 2 acres off the Homestead Road. So I was informed by the city attorney's office that I needed to recuse myself, so I did. So I handed everything over to the vice mayor. And then the one staff made a recommendation that we were on the 3rd tier, which means no recommendation. My family went ahead and withdrew our application. We put it in writing, more or less, it was like action.
It's like Perry Mason running back in, I remember.
And then we gave it to the city clerk, and then I waited until the city attorney's office, which was you, to call me back in, and I took over the hearing. So what makes that different from this, or maybe do you need a little bit more time to think about it, to research it?
No, what happened is it's whether or not it can be segmented. What happened with your particular issue, which was fortunately resolved, is, first of all, we could only segment it after we made a decision on that tier, to put you in a certain tier, because the number that we have from HCD is one number. So it's whatever it was, 1,064.
She has it memorized.
Oh, I'm sure. So what happened is that if it wasn't the family property, it would be somebody else. So it's all part of a collective. So the way to segment that was to put it in a different tier, which we did, so that you could actually proceed to discuss Tier 1. So it's actually very similar. Do you remember when you went down to Tier 1, it didn't go away? That you were just talking about whether or not it was going to be considered.
But wouldn't it be the easiest way to be safe is if there was a conflict, is just to write a letter to FPPC and ask him and just have it in writing to make sure that you don't have a conflict of interest?
Well, yes, of course, but, I mean, or should we talk around, I mean, we're talking about Rod and Apple. I mean, I don't know whether we should, or other people and other issues, and there's no question that there is a conflict of interest, but it's also clear that just like you adopt the budget every year, you can segment out decisions pertaining to Apple or Verizon or whatever particular issue you have, and can proceed with the rest of it.
I'm not sure I understood what Gilbert's issue is, so can you explain it to me without going into details of the past project? What
happened is that there was a discussion about whether there were more housing applicants for being included in the housing element than possible. So you had to pick which ones were going to be included in the housing element and kind of rate them. Some were more likely, some were less likely. And then what happened is that as we went along through the process, there was a discussion of moving it down so it wasn't very likely, so you could only discuss the really significant ones, and then there was a big dramatic withdrawal, so they completely withdrew any type of
So it was not
appearance.
specific to GPA? It wasn't an amendment?
It's specific on anything that's a whole, where you can't carve it out.
So I had to recuse myself on the GPA and housing element.
Got it, thank you.
Or
But then we
you
worked
would
it
have
out.
had.
And then we worked it out, correct. The city attorney was correct. But I did have to recuse myself.
So if I understand correctly, while the staff recommended process here would sync all the things up to bring them to the council in an input filter that we don't have today, at the same time, we're making discrete decisions on each project individually with its package of whatever the developer chooses to submit. Is that correct?
Right, and another point is you're not making a decision, in essence, on the substance. The reason why this is different from the discussion in October is you're talking about process. That they could bring them together, they could bring them anytime now, or they could bring them together. There'll be just different agenda items. It's a bundling process. Even if you were to take a vote even if you were to do this and take a vote, all that happens is you will just determine which ones suggesting or allowing to go forward. It doesn't mean that you'd ever even subsequently, ultimately approve, but there is supposed to be some comfort in the fact that you're allowing a particular project to go forward.
And this is an allocation process where we're not saying we're divvying up a pie a certain way. What we're basically saying is we can take all the projects, we can take none of the projects. It's not like there's this,
Correct.
right?
Right, there is no obligation, the
We
difference.
have no obligation to put any of these into the
Right.
input process.
Right, this is what's called a legislative act, so you don't have any of those other discussions. You can actually do all, none of the above, high, low, whatever blueprint or Bible you want for the city is completely up to you. So that's the answer.
Another question is not to embarrass you, but let's say that there was 2 or 3 projects, or let's say 5 projects, and Apple was one of them, and maybe we want to ask a question to Apple and say, would you do this because we feel that yours is lacking because C, D, and E is doing this, or E is doing that? Then how do you segment them apart if we're looking at them one by one?
Well, anytime the word,
We're
anytime
not
you-
doing a beauty contest, right?
But anytime you ask a question of Apple, that's, let's say, or let's not use poor Apple.
We use orange. We use
Let's
orange.
use,
An orange.
or we use, something printing company, okay, just to make it a little more academic, which, of course, it isn't. But anytime you're discussing that printing company, there is a conflict. So even if it's tangential, or even if you're talking about it, there is when anything you would have would affect that.
So you can't segment it.
You can segment it. You just, anytime the word printing company comes up, then there'd be a conflict and they'd have to step out. You can't, what I'm saying is you'd have to have separate agenda items.
But then how can we compare A, B, C, D, or E, and then maybe A we can segment out, B, C, D is fine, but then say, okay, we can't outbid A, and then we have, it's a very...
This isn't a this is not an auction, right? We're
Well-
taking a look at projects that happen to come in together so we can make a judgment about which we think are the best, which could be 0, could be 1, could be up to all of them.
It's very, if you look at this procedure, and the attachment says procedure for processing general plan application, it seems like it's put together in a pot, and we just compare them. And if one has a
You
better...
can use whatever criterion you want, I assume, to decide which
we
you
as the
want.
majority of the council can vote on it.
You
But-
individually can decide which projects you want to support based on how each one stacks up for you.
Not how explained to me. Maybe staff can explain to me. Maybe I'm not understanding it very well.
What I'm saying
RT.
is that if you were to do something like the budget, for example, where it is interrelated but not dependent, then you could segment it out. If you take a different step now that have to be put on the agenda where you'll say, we're only going to have 40,000 square feet of office in the next 5 years, and Apple is one of the applicants for that
the printing
40,000
company.
square foot, or the printing company, rather.
Yeah,
I'm
printing
sorry,
company.
your printing company is an applicant for that, where you are balancing like the housing element.
That's dividing a pie, right?
Dividing a pie. It's just pie or interrelated serial. Anyway,
I
so
get
we
it.
can make it work. So it just depends. If you wanted to create a conflict or create it as a collective, you certainly can adopt a general plan that has that. As a matter of fact, sometimes in the past, it has had that, where you've had a certain amount of square footage to be allocated. And in that situation, if you're competing or comparing, then anybody that owns stock or has a conflict relating to the printing company has to walk off.
But wouldn't it defeat the purpose of tonight's discussion is that we want to have a process where we can streamline it, look what the different pieces of the pie looks, and then move forward?
Well, it's not how it's currently structured. If you could present that as a thought, that you want to have go back to the idea of having a certain, right now, the philosophy is we're all built out. Right now, the philosophy is we don't have, and we aren't announcing to the community or the world that we have 40,000, 100,000, 2 million, or whatever square foot of development. It's the complete opposite. We're saying we're at 0. If there's any extraordinary, separate and independent projects that want to come in and say, yoo-hoo, you know, we're terrific, and we want you to basically break your moratorium, then they have to come up with some really great reasons for you. But that's all separate and independent. So it's two different ways. You could go back to the way you've done it in the past and say, we're not all built out. We are allowing X amount of square footage. And in that case, then there would be a conflict because you're back to making pies. Now you've said 0 square footage. We're not doing anything anymore. If people want to come in, you better come in all at the same time, because we don't know what we're going to do. And it has to be a really extraordinary project. So
In other words, the next company to come in with asking for a substantial general office allocation needs a general plan amendment to do so, right?
That's correct.
as a global concept, there's some little pots in there too, but that are still there.
Yeah,
But basically, that's what we're talking about tonight.
right.
Is a
We're
moratorium.
talking about our general office allocation.
Well, right, in general, height, then lots of things, yes. But the concept is that Cupertino's commodity, unlike other places that have a commodity of limitation of water or streets or whatever, Cupertino has a limited amount of development that it's going to allow. What they're saying is we are restricted. Some people are restricted because of physical things. You are restricted because of ideology and also the fact that you're built out. That's the philosophy of your general plan you're looking at. If you want to change it and allow development and say we're not conceptually and ideologically built out right now, and you want to change it all and allow more development as part of your general plan, you're going to have to go back and change it, because that's not what you're looking
We
at.
would have to go back and refill
You
the
have to
hotel
start all over
pool,
again,
the
and-
office pool, all these
And it'll,
things, right?
guess what's going to happen more than 2 months from now?
Out of curiosity, what's the difference between
Right.
voluntary community amenities and community benefits?
Community benefits, we purposefully didn't use that word because it's a term of art. It basically is used by Morgan Hill, by other cities where they actually have more of a beauty contest. This has benefits to the community, but doesn't have the specific definition that has been used up and down the state. So if you can think of it, benefits to the community, it's just because the other word is a term of art and has been used for really specific things, particularly in terms of housing, affordable housing, and things like that.
Systems too.
Point systems, I mean, it's more formalized. It's a rating system, usually adopted by ordinances or zoning or this, and it's
Community
actually,
benefits.
yeah, community benefits. It's just a term of art. I mean, it doesn't sound like a very specialized word, but
And the
it
difference
is.
in voluntary community amenities is then?
Just the point system is based on the approach that Carol had mentioned, that there is built-in growth in the general plan.
Okay.
That you're allowing growth, but for a certain number of points, you're giving certain amount of, So we wanted to get away from that, because what we're specifically doing is not building that growth in the general plan and requiring people. So we wanted to differentiate the term.
Okay. But if you look at the definition of the voluntary community amenities, A, school resources, B, public open space such as parks and trails, C, public facilities and utilities such as library, community centers, or utility systems, D, transportation facilities with emphasis on citywide bicycle pedestrians, transit improvements such as community shuttles, pedestrians, bicycle bridges, transit centers, etc. So A, B, C, or D applicant will come and probably give a dollar amount for each of those 4 different categories, or help me envision, help me walk through the process, please.
Please fill in where but there were two parts to it. We wanted to make sure that people didn't bring anything they wanted. For example, say I built a swimming pool in my project, that's a community amenity, right? It needed to be.
I understand, but my question is
right.
that, based on this criteria, I'm not questioning.
Right.
I just want to stick through what the draft is. Would A, B, or C applicant give a dollar amount, or they would actually build it, or?
They would make whatever offer they chose to make.
It's voluntary,
You're
so they
making
can
good points. That's
decide
exactly
whether they want any or none.
Right. There is no mandatory anything here, and that's why, for example, since it's all voluntary, a developer could come in and say, I want to give $30 million or $20,000 to schools. You can't require it. It can't be part of anything, but that could be part of the things that would provide an opportunity to actually get something here that you couldn't. And all those things you listed, by the way, they're all policies in your general plan. We're not freelancing or making things up. Those are things that are all reflected as community values in this Bible or blueprint.
The only difference is that it's not through a voluntary community amenities. Usually we do it through a development agreement or some other mechanism. This mechanism is not.
Well,
in the
I'm just saying
general
that those are policies that we just kind of summarized.
Yeah, correct.
That we thought.
I agree
we
with you,
thought that-
Carol.
that-
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, some of us have asked a lot of questions. How about the rest of you? Or comments?
I did want a question on clarification on what you just said. From what I understood, if it was offered as an amenity, it would eventually be in the DA.
Yeah, that's the only way we could bind them to the commitment.
So it would eventually be
Yes.
in that. And at what stage would the community have an input?
They would have an input at the beginning and at the end for sure, and possibly during the middle.
Because one of the questions from one of the residents here was there isn't sufficient noticing for the community to actually make that comment. So will that approach be different going forward?
Well, we'll use the same, we generally send postcards to every resident every time there's a hearing on something of this magnitude. We'd continue to do that. We continue to put it in the typical social media, all those kinds of things that we do now.
But from what I
That
understand,
was-
the hearing is different from the input part of the process.
Well, so one of the things we heard from the community is these DAs come close to the end and we don't get input. That's why we said if you are providing anything, let people know ahead of time so they're able to look at the project, they're able to come to the council meeting and speak to it.
So when you say council meeting, so this is where I'm a little confused.
Meeting at which you would decide whether or not to let them through the gate. It's the first meeting you'll
Yeah,
have.
And that would be the first meeting where the community gets to have their input.
Yes, that as soon as the deadline is up and we put the projects up is when they'll get to see it.
Okay.
We would prefer that the applicants don't bring it at the end, that they bring it in the beginning. That's why we said if you're bringing anything, give people a heads up ahead of time.
Okay, so now you've confused me. When you say give
right.
people a heads up ahead of time, what is?
So here's an example. If we didn't have this amenity thing in here, and we said, don't let us know up front, they might decide later on, at the end of the project, to spring an amenity or something. At that time, no one would have had input, right?
So you mean by the time the project is already under construction and it's deployed?
No,
It's
before the
through the
final
gate.
entitlement.
Before the
right?
entitlement.
Right, before the
Okay,
entitlement.
okay,
So
got it.
all we want to say is, whatever you want to do with the project, provide that information up front. That was our intent. It wasn't to say you have to provide an amenity. It said, because what we heard from the community is if there is a DA and benefits being discussed or amenities being discussed, we want to know ahead of time. So that's the only reason we put it in there. If people don't want to know ahead of time, that's perfectly fine. We can take that requirement out.
Thank you.
I guess the other question was expressed as some skepticism as to how communities enforce things done under development agreements. So benefits, however they're provided, or terms. How have we enforced them, and how are they enforced by others to ensure that they actually happen?
Typically, anything over and above the typical requirements and mitigations are enforced through the development agreement. And that development agreement allows the council to decide what the phasing of the provision of the amenities would be, what the penalties would be
Right.
if they weren't provided.
We do this on the dais. Remember, we're sitting here and somebody will stand up and they'll say, well, gee, maybe I'll reduce the unit by this, or I'll provide a swimming pool, or I'll provide this or that. And I'll say, well, we can't require that, but would you come back up to the dais and determine whether or not you're going to volunteer to do that? And then the person walks up and they say yes, and then you say, okay.
Well,
and then you include it in the conditions of approval on the.
I understand, but.
So, I mean, it's
So-
common. You do
so-
a lot, actually.
We do it, yes, we do, but I'm asking, what is there for typical enforcement to ensure that these conditions are fulfilled, maintained over time? What sort of things do we do? What things do other cities do to ensure that somebody having entered into a voluntary benefit or whatever, right, as part of a project fulfills that? What sort of teeth do we have?
Well, these are contracts like any other contract, so any of the remedies that would be available. I think one of the speakers mentioned a Palo Alto project that was getting fined. I think essentially that was what the city agreed in its development agreement, as maybe one of the penalties was a fine for not fulfilling one of the obligations. So that would be potential. It could be denial of an entitlement benefit that had been granted.
Or you just don't let them move in.
Right, yeah. Failure to
That's,
occupy.
I think, what we've done on Main Street, right? We said, you have to do so-and-so much before you have any right to,
Right, that was actually a condition of
Occupy?
approval. This would be,
which is like pretty, that has some teeth.
well, and development agreements can have penalties that stretch out for years and years and years, way after occupancy.
Okay.
Right. And you adopt development agreements by ordinances. So actually, you could include all sorts of municipal remedies that,
Yeah.
that you have in your municipal code. It's probably the best defensible vehicle going. You have an ordinance, you have the municipal code protections, you have contract protections, you have public
So
process
in the
protections.
case cited
you
here,
have
if
building
Palo Alto is
protections.
fining $500 a day, and that's not, let's say that is chump change to whoever owns the project, would they be able to do more, enforce more, fine more over time, or would that have to have been written into
I am
the DA?
ultimately confident that your next city attorney will take adequate protections to protect you.
Okay.
Shucks, I'm going to hurt one.
All right, so we just
No,
have
no,
to,
they-
I mean, what I'm hearing is you just have to make sure that when these DAs are done, that you have adequate teeth.
That's correct.
All right, okay.